On an ordinary morning in 1815, Captain James Riley went to work just like you do. He had his routine, his crew, his schedule. But within a matter of days, this completely standard work trip ended in a violent shipwreck.
Yeah, and not just a shipwreck, but capture by nomadic tribesmen.
Right. And a forced march across the Sahara Desert where his men were literally drinking camel urine just to survive another 24 hours. I mean, you think you're just doing your job, and suddenly, through no fault of your own, you are plunged into one of the most harrowing survival nightmares ever recorded.
It's terrifying because, well, the terror really stems from how incredibly mundane the beginning is. Like the American merchant ship, the commerce, it just departs from Connecticut on a standard trading voyage.
Just a regular Tuesday for them.
Exactly. They have an experienced crew, they're optimistic, and they are completely unaware of how quickly modern predictability, or, the 1815 equivalent of it, can just simply vanish when nature decides to turn.
So our mission for today's deep dive is to explore excerpts from the book Skeletons on the Zahara, which details exactly what happened to Riley and the crew of the Commerce. We're going to look at the mechanics of survival, the brutal socioeconomics of the desert, and what happens to the human mind when it is stripped of absolutely everything.
It is a massive topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do things go off the rails for a seasoned captain and his ship?
Well, the breakdown happens systematically. They make a totally standard stop at Gibraltar and then head toward the Cape Verde Islands. And in 1815, navigation relies heavily on clear skies and dead reckoning.
Right.
You need to be able to see the stars or the sun to know precisely where you are.
Right, no GPS back then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But off the coast of North Africa, the Commerce gets swallowed by this incredibly dense, unnatural fog. I mean, visibility drops to absolute zero.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they lose their celestial markers, and without those, they are flying blind, and the ship is driven violently onto the jagged, barren coast of what is now Western Sahara.
It's the ultimate sailor's nightmare. But surviving the wreck actually turns out to be the worst thing that could have happened to them. Because they didn't sink in the deep water, they crashed onto a landscape that offers zero shelter, zero food, and zero fresh water.
Right. The immediate aftermath is just a desperate scramble. The ship is breaking apart in the surf, and they are trying to salvage whatever supplies they can, but they quickly realize the land they are staring at is a death sentence.
Just endless sand.
Yeah, there is a towering cliff face, and beyond that, just endless scorching sand, which prompts an incredibly desperate escape attempt.
Right. The sources outline how they repair a small, battered longboat and try to launch it back into the ocean. It's like being trapped in a burning building where the only exit door leads straight into a wall of fire.
That is a great analogy.
Yeah, they figure
must
their
belong
odds
to
are
one of
better
the
trying to
tenants
flag
staying
down a
here.
passing ship in the shipping
hand
lanes
it
and
into the
walking
lost
into the
and found.
Sahara. But the ocean rejects
Maybe
them.
I can take
The surf
this
is
if
so
no one
violent it just
notices.
pummels the small boat and throws them right back onto the beach.
It is a chilling moment. The ocean refuses to take them, and the desert is just waiting to kill them. And the psychological blow of that moment is immense.
I can only imagine.
When the surf forces them back onto the sand, the reality of their isolation really solidifies. Their bodies are already beginning to weaken from the adrenaline crash, the lack of food, and the immediate onset of thirst.
Right.
But the collapse of their escape plan introduces a dangerous mental vulnerability.
Which makes me wonder about the specific worldview these sailors held, because they operate on a maritime code. Like in their minds, if you survive a shipwreck, you wait for a rescue,
Right, exactly.
signal another ship, or you find locals on the coast who offer aid, maybe contact a consulate. So when a group of local nomadic tribesmen, the Sahrawi Arabs, appear on the dunes, the sailors must have felt an overwhelming surge of relief. Was their initial hope of rescue actually their biggest mental vulnerability here?
Oh, absolutely. That worldview is precisely what makes the next few hours so devastating. The crew applies European maritime logic to the deep Sahara. They see humans and they think rescue.
But that's not how it works there.
Not at all. These nomadic tribesmen operate under a completely different economic and environmental reality. In the Sahara, survival is about absolute scarcity. Resources dictate every single human interaction.
Right.
So to the tribesmen, the desert hasn't just delivered stranded men in need of a rescue operation. Think about how quickly your own worldview would shatter if the very people you ran to for help put you in chains.
Because to them, the desert has delivered inventory.
Yes, the desert has delivered a windfall of highly valuable commodities. The tribesmen don't look at a sailor and see a victim. They see a biological battery that can perform labor, or a tradable asset that can be sold at a market.
Wow.
So the crew is immediately swarmed, violently stripped of their clothing, beaten and enslaved.
I try to imagine the mental whiplash of that transition. You go from being a respected, specialized professional to a shipwreck victim to literal livestock in the span of an afternoon.
It is incomprehensible.
The very people you were running toward for help are the ones putting you in chains. But as horrific as the enslavement is, the captors aren't even the primary antagonist of this story, are they? The environment itself is doing the most damage.
That is exactly right. The Sahara dictates the terms of their new reality. The tribesmen force the crew to march inland, away from the coast. And this introduces the biological reality of extreme dehydration.
Right.
We aren't just talking about being thirsty. The human body is a water-based machine, and when it is forced to march under a blazing sun with zero intake, the mechanical failures begin almost immediately.
Because their bodies are desperately trying to cool down. Right. So they're sweating out whatever moisture they have left, but there's nothing to replace it.
Exactly the mechanism. The sweat glands shut down to conserve the remaining fluid, which means the body's core temperature begins to skyrocket.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Without water, the blood literally begins to thicken. It turns into a sludge. The heart has to pump violently just to push this thickened blood through the veins.
That sounds agonizing.
It is. And the kidneys, lacking fluid to filter toxins, simply stop working.
And as the body is mechanically shutting down, the visible toll is just grotesque. The sources describe their lips cracking open and bleeding, their skin blistering and peeling off in sheets because they have no clothes to protect them from the sun.
Yeah, it is brutal.
Their bodies are cannibalizing their own muscle and fat just to keep the organs functioning. How does a human brain process that level of degradation without entirely snapping?
Well, what is fascinating here is the intersection of that physiological collapse and the psychological breaking point. As the blood thickens and the kidneys fail, toxins build up in the bloodstream and reach the brain.
Oh, I see.
This physically alters their brain chemistry, pushing them into a state of severe delirium. The environment systematically strips away the higher order reasoning.
Which explains the unthinkable measures they take just to endure another hour. I mean, we read about these men drinking camel urine. On a normal day, we might complain if our iced coffee is a little watered down on a hot afternoon. But these men were reduced to consuming hot, toxic animal waste just to see tomorrow.
Right.
But based on what you were saying about the brain chemistry, that is not just a gross survival tactic. That is a delirious brain overriding every human instinct just to introduce any form of moisture into a failing system.
Precisely.
And right at the edge of total biological failure, the narrative takes a sharp left turn. We transition from this pure, agonizing physical survival into a massive game of psychological strategy. And it hinges on a shift in ownership.
Yes. The remaining crew members are sold to a new captor, a trader named C.D. Hammett. And the introduction of C.D. Hammett alters the entire equation.
How so?
Up until now, the initial captors treated the sailors as disposable labor. If one died, it was a minor loss. But Hammett is a businessman operating within the Trans-Saharan Trade Network.
Okay, so he sees them differently.
Right. He looks at Captain Riley and the emaciated crew and sees a different kind of value. He sees the potential for a high-yield ransom. They finally catch what you might call a lucky break, because Hammett is motivated by profit, not just cruelty.
I have to push back a little on framing C.D. Hammett as a lucky break, though, because he is essentially just practicing predatory venture capitalism with human lives.
That is fair.
I mean, he isn't buying them to save them. He is injecting just enough capital in the form of drops of water and scraps of food to keep his assets breathing until he can cash them out. If the market value drops to zero, he leaves them in the sand.
That is a harsh but highly accurate assessment of the Saharan slave economy. Hammett is an investor managing a very fragile portfolio.
Right.
And Captain Riley, despite being delirious and starving, recognizes the mechanics of this relationship. He understands that Hammett is looking for a payout.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Riley realizes his only leverage is Hammett's greed. So he sits down in the sand and tells a massive, completely fabricated lie.
A huge lie.
He tells Hammett that he has a network of incredibly wealthy friends in a coastal trading city called Mogador, which is hundreds of miles away in present-day Morocco. Riley basically says, hey, if you march us to Mogador, my contacts will pay an absolute fortune for our release.
And the brilliant opportunism of this bluff lies in how it structurally changes their dynamic. Riley has no idea if there is anyone in Mogador who will pay a dime. It is a total shot in the dark.
Yeah.
But by inventing this wealthy contact, Riley shifts himself and his crew from being passive victims waiting to expire into active participants in a business transaction. He manufactures a financial incentive for Hammett to keep them alive.
He is making the ultimate high-stakes poker bluff, and his crew's lives are the chips in the center of the table.
Yep.
And Hammett takes the bet.
He does.
He agrees to point his caravan toward Mogador. But the prize for winning that negotiation is a grueling 2-month journey across the most hostile terrain on the planet.
The physical reality of that 2-month march is almost incomprehensible. They are traveling 1,000 miles on foot, occasionally allowed onto a camel.
Unbelievable.
They endure violent, blinding sandstorms that last for days, forcing them to lie face down in the dirt just to breathe. They are existing on starvation rations, but, the Sahara is a great equalizer.
What do you mean?
Well, the environment is so utterly devoid of resources that Sidi Hammett and his own men begin to starve and dehydrate right alongside the enslaved crew.
Oh, wow. Think about the social dynamics of that. It is like a CEO and a brand new intern getting trapped together in a broken elevator.
That's a good way to picture it.
For the first 5 hours, the hierarchy is crystal clear. The CEO is giving orders. But by day 4, when the air conditioning is dead, there is no water, and they are both suffocating in the heat, the titles completely evaporate.
Exactly.
The suits don't matter. It is just 2 organisms trying to survive a steel box. Out there in the deep desert, the rigid lines between master and slave start to blur because the sun is trying to kill all of them equally.
The environment forces a profound mutual dependence. It is akin to 2 sworn enemies stranded on a tiny life raft in the middle of the ocean. One might technically own the raft, but if they don't row together, they both die.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
There are moments on this march where Hammett has to rely on the resilience of Riley and his men just to push the caravan forward. A strange, complex trust forms out of pure necessity.
But the engine that actually keeps the crew moving isn't just mutual survival, is it? It is the psychological architecture that Captain Riley builds for them. We have to dig into his leadership here.
You do.
How does a captain lead when he has absolutely zero authority, no food to distribute, and his men are drinking camel urine? What is he actually managing?
He is managing the one resource that hasn't dried up, which is hope. Riley intuitively understands that if the men stop believing in the lie, their bodies will simply shut down.
Right.
So he constantly reinforces the narrative. He tells them over and over, we are going to Mogador, we are going to be ransomed, you are going to see your families. He weaponizes this fabricated hope.
Weaponized hope. I love that.
Yeah, the men bind together in this deep brotherhood of suffering, relying on Riley's absolute certainty. Hope becomes the biological fuel that keeps their legs moving when the calories run out.
So this weaponized hope carries them across 1,000 miles of sand. They endure the 2 months, the sandstorms, the starvation, and they finally reach the outskirts of Mogador.
They finally make it.
The physical trial of the desert is coming to an end, but the psychological tension is just spiking. Because the desert didn't care if Riley was lying. The sand doesn't ask for receipts.
Right, exactly.
But Mogador is a real city with real merchants, and Sidi Hammett expects to get paid.
Reaching the city limits brings the entire bluff to its breaking point. Hammett has kept his assets alive, he has endured the march himself, and now he demands the capital. He needs tangible proof that Riley's wealthy European contacts actually exist.
And Riley has nothing, so he has to double down on the bluff. He writes a desperate pleading letter. He addresses it to the European consuls in Mogador.
Men he has never even met.
Men who might not even be there. He basically writes, "My name is Captain Riley. My men and I are starving. Please pay this massive ransom or we will be dragged back into the desert to die."
The mechanics of this letter transfer are incredibly fragile. Riley has to hand this scrap of paper to a member of Hammett's tribe,
Right.
who then has to carry it into a walled, bustling international trading city, find a European who can read English, and convince them to read the ravings of a supposed captive. Statistically, that letter should have ended up in the dirt.
It is the 1815 equivalent of sending an email into the spam folder of the universe and praying a billionaire actually opens it, reads it, and replies with a rescue team.
Yeah.
The odds are practically zero.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it underscores how deeply vulnerable human survival can be to the chaotic variable of empathy. By sheer, unadulterated luck, that letter finds its way into the hands of a British merchant named William Wilshire.
Use a sponge for this,
Wilshire
please.
has no obligation to Riley. He doesn't know him. Paying this ransom is a significant risk of his own capital, but Wilshire reads the letter, he is profoundly moved by the desperation in the words, and he makes a unilateral decision to act.
A total stranger reads a piece of paper and decides to alter history.
Precisely. Wilshire pays the exorbitant ransom out of his own funds. One man's split-second decision to care about a stranger is the only thing that validates 2 months of unspeakable suffering.
It cashes the massive psychological check that Riley wrote out in the sand.
Exactly. With the ransom paid, Riley and the surviving members of his crew are finally pulled from the desert and freed.
So what does this all mean? The euphoria of the rescue is undeniable, but the reality of the aftermath is incredibly heavy.
It is.
The men are no longer slaves, but they are physically broken, they are emaciated, their bodies are permanently damaged, and they carry a psychological trauma that simply didn't have a name in 1815.
Right.
Captain Riley does make it back home. He writes this extensive account of his ordeal, and it becomes a massive cultural touchstone, shedding light on the brutal realities of the trans-Saharan slave trade and the absolute outer limits of human endurance.
Riley's account remains a crucial piece of historical documentation, but there's a lingering shadow over this text that we have to acknowledge. Well, James Riley survived because of his sheer ingenuity. He survived because he was a captain, because he understood negotiation, and ultimately because of a miraculous stroke of luck with William Wilshire.
Right, a letter.
But think about the socioeconomics of the desert we discussed earlier. The Sahara didn't just capture American captains. Think about the countless other individuals, ordinary sailors, travelers, local Africans caught in the trade, who were dragged into that deep desert.
People who couldn't write a letter in English.
Exactly. People who didn't hold a rank. People who couldn't convincingly invent a wealthy contact to manipulate a captor's greed.
Yeah.
Or whose desperate letters simply fell into the dust in a crowded market. What incredible, harrowing stories of human endurance, of brotherhood and suffering were swallowed by the sands, lost forever to history.
Purely because there was no one at the end of the road to pay the ransom.
Exact.
It really makes you wonder how many silent voices the desert is still holding on to. It is a sobering perspective on luck, privilege, and survival. Something to ponder as you go about the rest of your day.